The federal courtroom in Manhattan fell into a heavy silence, as though every sound had been sucked into the glowing text message now projected on the large screen at the center of the room. No one moved. Even the scribbling of reporters' pens or the soft cough of the court clerk seemed to vanish, replaced by the stark simplicity and profound impact of a few words, "Merry Christmas. I love you so, so much." Text from Mia to Sean Combs. December 27th, 2018, defense attorney Brian Steele stepped toward the witness stand holding a printed copy of the message in his hand. His voice, low but razor-sharp, cut through the tension like a scalpel. "The man who assaulted you, who locked you in a mansion for 3 days, who held a gun to your head, is the same man to whom you texted, 'I love you so, so much.'" A female juror in the second row tilted her head slightly, her brows tightening. A wave of discomfort rippled through the courtroom, not because of the attorney's words, but because of the jarring collision of two realities: a woman who testified she was raped, and that same woman sending words of love just months later. Mia sat still. She didn't cry. She didn't avert her eyes from Brian Steele, nor did she glance pleadingly at the jury. She simply closed her eyes, once then opened them again as if grounding herself in her breath. "I didn't love who he was," she said slowly. "I loved the hope I projected onto him. I thought, if I was good enough, loyal enough, he would stop." Just 45 minutes earlier, Mia had delivered an entirely different narrative, her voice, trembling eyes, darting hands clenched so tightly they turned white. She spoke of nights locked in a windowless room inside Diddy's villa in St. Bart's. She recounted a summer evening in 2017 when she refused to take part in a freak-off, a term Cassie had previously used to describe a sex party, and was beaten unconscious. The next morning, she awoke naked, surrounded by surveillance cameras and empty sedative bottles. She had no physical evidence, no video, no medical report. What she did have were memories and the courage to recount them in front of strangers, reporters, and above all, the vacant eyes of the man who once told her he loved her. But then when the defense requested the display of personal messages exchanged between her and Diddy retrieved from a seized phone during a 2024 search, the dynamics shifted instantly. A chain of messages spanning nearly 18 months appeared before the court. "You are my protector. Thank you for always being there. I'm sorry I was difficult yesterday. I just miss your energy. I know you love me. And I love you. I just wish things could be simpler." Brian Steele said nothing further. He handed printed copies to each juror, allowing them to read in silence. The courtroom grew as quiet as a graveyard at midnight. One member of the press whispered to a colleague, "Shit." She still loved him. But prosecutor Emily Johnson refused to let the silence settle. She stepped forward, clutching a thick folder, and pointed to a message dated March 15th, 2019. "I just wish you'd stop yelling, stop disappearing, stop making me feel like I don't exist unless I'm naked." Then she read a voice memo Mia had recorded for herself in the Notes app, dated August 2019, a few weeks after leaving her role as Diddy's assistant. "He loves me. I think he does. Or maybe he loves the way I break for him. I don't know anymore." Victim psychology, a still emerging but increasingly critical component in sexual assault trials, was introduced immediately to contextualize the conflicting evidence. Dr. Renee Hollister, a forensic psychologist who had testified in the Harvey Weinstein case, was brought to the stand. Victims in manipulative relationships often maintain emotional ties to their abusers, not because they're foolish or complicit, but because they're trapped in a reward and punishment cycle, a deeply effective form of psychological control that creates the illusion of love. She presented a graph charting interactions between Mia and Diddy, revealing a pattern. Every freak-off or major argument was followed by a flurry of affectionate messages. "I miss you, got you a new dress, sending the jet to take you to Paris." The defense objected. "She's speculating about intent based on non-objective data." Dr. Hollister responded firmly, I'm not speculating intent. I'm analyzing behavior, and this is textbook abusive behavior. Outside the courtroom, public opinion was split. One side believed Mia was a genuine victim trying to survive in a world where power could erase all traces. The other side, often composed of Diddy's loyal fans, or those affiliated with his circle, painted her as an opportunist, reworking the past for compensation, attention, or revenge. But for the jury, truth could not be determined by sentiment. They were bound by law. And in law, especially federal law, emotion isn't enough. Evidence is, and the evidence was turning against her testimony. The trial proceeded. Yet Mia's gaze when she looked at the message, "I love you so much," glowing on the screen might have been the most haunting image of the day. Not because it proved she lied, but because it revealed that in a manipulated relationship, the truth is never black and white. Every message was a shard of survival psychology, and sometimes to survive, you learn to love the person who broke you. In the digital age, everything can be documented from late-night bursts of longing to deep, unspoken fear. A heart emoji, a midnight "I miss you." To the outside world, these look like tokens of affection. But in the context of a federal criminal trial, where the defendant is accused of rape, false imprisonment, and human trafficking, those same words become exhibits. Not merely to prove or disprove guilt, but to illuminate the fragile and contradictory nature of a coerced relationship. Mia, an alias granted by the federal court to protect her real identity, had worked as Sean P. Diddy Combs's personal assistant for nearly 8 years. She wasn't a stranger to the glittering world of entertainment. Intelligent, academically accomplished, she had worked at a major record label before joining Bad Boy Entertainment. But as she testified, that's when the lines between work affection and personal safety began to blur quickly. Everything was wrapped in something called love until you realized it was a leash. That's how Mia described her relationship with Diddy to the jury. She spoke of controlled schedules, not being allowed to leave the house without an escort, and the so-called freak-offs, an internal term Diddy allegedly used to refer to parties where women were coerced into participating in group sexual acts, sometimes recorded on hidden cameras. In her nearly 4-hour testimony, Mia didn't just describe specific actions being slapped, threatened with a gun, having her salary withheld, but she delved into the emotional erosion, feeling like she was no longer a person, but a programmable software. Diddy, according to her, didn't need to yell every day. He simply had to stay silent at the right moment or give the right gift so that she would adjust her behavior to his expectations. Yet just when the image of a victim was becoming more concrete, defense attorney Brian Steele presented a trove of text messages extracted from Mia's phone, personal messages never sent to anyone but Diddy. The messages spanned from May 2018 through early 2021, well after Mia had supposedly cut all contact. "I had a nightmare I was being chased by R. Kelly and you saved me. Life is effing insane, but I love you with all my heart. Hey, saw our doc on Netflix Top 10. Congrats. I miss you." The courtroom fell silent as these messages were read aloud. An African-American female reporter seated in the back row whispered to her colleague, "She still loves him, no matter what happened." But prosecutor Emily Johnson struck back immediately. She didn't deny the messages. Instead, she labeled them as living proof of how victims remain psychologically manipulated even after escaping physical captivity. She called a clinical psychologist to the stand, Dr. Elise Kramer, who had worked with the FBI in over 10 cases involving victims under psychological control in high-power environments. Dr. Kramer explained, "Many victims in prolonged abusive relationships, especially in scenarios involving economic and emotional dependency, develop something called bonded trauma. It's where the victim is not only harmed, but also forms a distorted emotional attachment to their abuser. They love the version of the perpetrator they hoped existed, not the person themselves. A text saying, 'I love you,' is not proof of consent. It's evidence of desperation, of trying to win back acceptance from the one who shattered their self-worth." However, Diddy's legal team didn't back down. They played a video clip from Diddy's 45th birthday party where Mia filmed from an unofficial camera angle, laughed loudly, and told friends, "He's the kindest person I've ever worked with. Always remembers my birthday. Always listens." Next came a 2020 Instagram screenshot where Mia commented on one of Diddy's posts' icon, leader, friend. Once again, truth seemed to blur. The judge called for a recess. The jury filed out. But inside the courtroom, reporters began to murmur, had the prosecution anticipated these pieces of evidence, and if so, were they prepared to decode them? After the break, Emily Johnson resumed her rebuttal. She presented a data report extracted from Mia's phone containing 112 unsent messages, drafts Mia had written but never sent. Many of these drafts revealed raw, painful emotions. "I can't breathe around you. But I can't breathe without you either. You taught me to fear silence. You said you'd never let me go. You didn't say you'd hold me with chains." She turned to the jury and said, "This is the other side of the truth. The part the people in this courtroom need to see. The part the victim believed no one would ever want to hear." The jury's body language began to shift. The skeptical expressions softened. A middle-aged man identified in court records as a former police officer nodded slowly as Dr. Kramer elaborated. "Psychological control doesn't have to scream. It just needs time, money, and prestige, and in the entertainment world, those three can buy submission." During redirect, Mia was asked a single question. "Did you ever love him?" She paused for 5 seconds, then looked directly at the judge. "I loved the person I thought he was. But when I saw who he really was, I knew I had to get out." She finished, then gave a small smile, not of relief, but the exhausted smile of someone who had survived the unspeakable. Outside the courthouse, hashtags began to trend. Believe Mia. Believe the victim, even if she once said, "I love you." Texts are not consent. Messages aren't consent. Silent survivors. Those who survived in silence. Inside the courtroom, prosecutor Emily Johnson concluded the rebuttal with a single sentence, short enough to remain in the official transcript. If someone texts, "I love you," after being hurt, the fault isn't theirs. It's with the person who made them believe love was the only way to survive. In cases involving sexual abuse or psychological manipulation, the most confounding factor for juries isn't physical evidence. It's the gray zone between emotion and action. A smile in a photo. A midnight "I love you" text. A birthday greeting. All of it can be weaponized either to defend the accused or to reveal the depth of invisible control. In the case against Sean P. Diddy Combs, the biggest question by day 19 of the trial was no longer, did Mia suffer abuse? It was, can someone who's been harmed love the one who hurt them, and does that strip her of credibility as a witness? Defense attorney Brian Steele believed it did. In court, he presented over 40 text messages from Mia to Diddy spanning 2018 to early 2021. These messages contained affectionate language apologies for not being good enough and emotionally intense voice memos that, in his words, showed emotion but not fear. If she was threatened, why didn't she tell anyone? If she was raped, why did she stay for 2 more years? Brian Steele looked directly at the jury as he spoke. Ladies and gentlemen, maybe this is just a young woman who loved deeply and got hurt. But love cannot be turned into an accusation. Emily Johnson didn't challenge the form. She didn't deny the existence of the messages. Instead, she invited the jury into a deeper layer where law intersects with victim psychology, where what's normal is flipped by the force of power and fear. She called to the stand Dr. Dawn Hughes, a forensic psychologist who had testified in high-profile cases involving Harvey Weinstein, R. Kelly, and Ghislaine Maxwell. In the dense air of the courtroom, her voice was clear. When someone is trapped in a long-term abusive relationship, they don't always recognize they're a victim. Often they rationalize the abuser's actions by thinking, "It's my fault. I'm not worthy." I need to try harder. She presented a psychological diagram titled The Cycle of Emotional Dependency, divided into 4 stages: euphoria. The manipulator showers the victim with affection gifts and attention, making them feel special. Punishment: sudden switch, yelling threats, coldness, or violence. Redemption: apologies, remorse, gifts, emotional or material. Repetition: the victim feels chosen and stays. This isn't theory. It's a pattern documented in hundreds of criminal cases. And in Mia's case, the messages and testimony align perfectly with this cycle. On screen, the messages were time-stamped and linked to events Mia had described. After the Christmas 2018 freak-off, I'm sorry if I made you upset. I was just overwhelmed. You are still my peace. After the argument over Kid Cudi, whom Mia was suspected of having feelings for prompting Diddy to threaten violence, I'll never betray you again. You're the only one who sees the real me. After being denied her passport and kept from leaving the St. Bart's villa, being with you is the only place I feel safe even when I'm afraid. Dr. Hughes explained, each message is not a sign of love. It's a symptom of psychological programming where the victim believes they're the cause of the abuse. She cited a past case, a woman whose boyfriend broke 2 of her ribs, but who later wrote him a letter of apology for making him angry. When asked why she didn't leave, the woman replied, I didn't think I'd find anyone better. Mia, when asked again in court, did not deny the messages. On the contrary, she affirmed, I wrote them because I wanted him to forgive me. Because I thought, if I loved enough, he would change. She paused, then looked toward Diddy, who sat motionless, expressionless. I didn't write those things because I was okay. I wrote them because I was desperate. The defense did not relent. During cross-examination, Brian Steele pressed on Mia's intelligence and professional background, emphasizing that she was educated, experienced in the industry, and familiar with psychological terminology. You studied introductory psychology. You've read books about toxic relationships. So how could you not recognize what was happening to you? Mia didn't answer immediately. She took a deep breath, then said, I wasn't in a classroom. I was in a room I didn't know if I'd ever get to leave. Theory didn't protect me. Smiling did. What made the trial so complex wasn't the lack of evidence, it was the emotional texture. The jury was asked to distinguish between genuine emotion and strategic testimony. They had to determine whether Mia was a true victim or someone reshaping memory to her advantage. Some jurors, according to court reporters closely following the case, initially leaned toward the possibility of fabrication. But after Dr. Hughes's testimony, that perception began to shift. One juror, a woman in her 50s, was overheard whispering as she exited the courtroom. There are things only women understand. The media began reframing Mia's story within a broader lens, victims in power-imbalanced relationships. The Atlantic published an article titled, When Love Becomes a Tool of Control, emphasizing, if text messages are the only metric for truth, then we have failed to understand the pain hidden behind every send button. On social media, dozens of women started posting the messages they once sent to the men who hurt them as a way of affirming that love does not equal consent and certainly isn't proof of safety. The hashtag #TextDon'tTell. The whole story began trending on Twitter. The trial continued. But it was clear that the appearance of Dr. Dawn Hughes and Mia's testimony on day 20 had reframed the entire narrative. Could the U.S. justice system handle cases where harm lived, not in bruises, but in the psychological wreckage of memories and emotion? And more profoundly, in a world where every feeling can be digitized, are we losing the ability to read real pain because we're too focused on what's typed? The defense team, wasting no time, leaned into the visual evidence to counter Mia's tearful testimony. In a surprise move on the morning of day 21, they played a short video just over a minute shot at Diddy's 44th birthday party in 2013. On the courtroom screen appeared a lavish party, flickering lights, champagne pouring, soft music playing. In frame was Mia, around 25 at the time, reapplying lipstick, smiling like a celebrity and saying, "Puff Daddy, the living legend himself. Thank you for being one of the biggest inspirations in my life." Applause echoed from the party guests behind her. Mia's face appeared radiant, confident, with no visible signs of fear or restraint. As the video ended, Brian Steele stepped into the center of the courtroom, remote in hand, his voice laced with challenge. "Ladies and gentlemen, is this your victim? A smart, independent, beautiful woman who once worked for Madonna, speaks 4 languages. Graduated summa cum laude from NYU, manipulated that easily, as she claims. Or is she an actress more skilled than any of us thought?" He paused, letting the moment settle, scanning the jury. "If any of you have ever been abused, lived in fear, or been controlled, could you stand in front of a camera and say something like that with a face like this?" Some nodded slowly. Others were deep in thought. This was the beginning of the character attack strategy. Steele didn't stop. He requested permission to present an internal performance evaluation of Mia signed by Diddy in 2015. In it, Diddy wrote, "Mia is focused, loyal, adaptable, and has a unique understanding of people. One of the finest assistants I've ever worked with." Steele asked, "Who compliments someone they're raping, and who keeps a glowing review from the person they claim imprisoned them, if it's all true?" He concluded with a striking phrase. "This is not a story of abuse. This is a story of revision." Emily Johnson was quick to respond. Calm and steady, she requested that a different clip from the same birthday party be played, one that hadn't been edited. In this longer segment, right after Mia's cheerful statement, the camera caught her stepping back, scanning the room. She moved close to the cameraman and whispered something inaudible. When enhanced, her lips were seen to mouth. Did he see that? Was it enough? Johnson froze the frame. She turned to the jury. No one said Mia never smiled. No one claimed she didn't know how to survive in an environment where smiling was the only armor. That's what makes victims of sophisticated abuse so difficult to identify. She pointed to the screen again. Not every happy face is proof of happiness. Sometimes it's a survival mechanism. Next, she presented a handwritten letter Mia had written to herself, found among personal files seized under the 2024 search warrant. The letter had no date, but its contents spoke volumes. "I've learned to breathe when no one lets me. I've learned to laugh when I want to scream. If I leave, he'll destroy me. If I stay, I'll disappear. So who am I?" Johnson closed her argument with a single chilling line. She is not the real Mia in that video. And she is not a fake today. She is a victim who learned to become the character her abuser needed her to be to survive one more day. As the jury exited the courtroom that afternoon, no one spoke to the press. But observers noted one thing: every face looked more tense than it had the day before. The truth was no longer simple, no longer just right or wrong, love or hate, consent or coercion. What remained was a murky space where identity, memory, and survival intersected, and in that space no tidy verdict could be reached. On the witness stand, Mia no longer resembled the woman who sobbed through the trial's early days. Her gaze had steadied, her voice low, and even as if what made her tremble wasn't the defense's sharp questioning anymore, but the unrelenting repetition of one question. If you were really abused, why didn't you leave? Why didn't you go to the police? It was the third time the question had surfaced, this time directly from the jury, submitted on a note passed to the judge. Mia looked up as she was asked to respond. She didn't flinch. She didn't deflect. She answered plainly, "Because I didn't think I was being abused." The room paused. "I didn't know it was abuse. I thought I was the problem. I thought I made him angry. I disappointed him. I pushed him too far." She took a long breath and continued, "And he also made me feel like I was special. Like I was the only one he didn't lay hands on. He used to say, 'If I didn't love you, you'd be like Cassie.' And I believed that was kindness." Her answer left many in the courtroom visibly shaken, not with disbelief, but with a kind of quiet grief. a silent, shared sorrow. Dr. Dawn Hughes had said it a day earlier during her testimony, control in abusive relationships isn't always about physical force. Sometimes it's control through feeling the feeling of owing someone, of being chosen, of needing to endure to be worthy. And now Mia was the living evidence of that claim. Prosecutor Emily Johnson returned to the stand, introducing a chain of internal emails between Mia and Bad Boy Records administrative manager, the person responsible for booking flights, hotels, and coordinating Diddy's personal meetings. In an email dated May 8, 2019, Mia wrote, "I can't fly to Paris this week. The bruises haven't faded. You know I'll have to answer if anyone sees." The reply from the admin manager appeared immediately after "I'll switch it to the Zurich hotel. No one knows us there. I'll tell housekeeping not to come in the mornings." Both names were signed. The email was sent from their official work accounts. The defense objected, arguing the email didn't explicitly identify who caused the bruises. But the judge allowed it, citing its relevance in showing the extent of concealment and the indirect systemic response surrounding the defendant. Next came a recovered audio recording, Mia speaking to an ex-girlfriend via an encrypted messaging app. Her voice was faint, nearly broken. "He never punched me, but he choked me every time I got it wrong, and I felt grateful that at least he didn't hit. You see, I'm going insane." Her friend asked, "Why don't you leave?" Mia answered, "Because if I leave, I have nothing. No job, no money, no one will believe me. Everything I've ever had was through him, even the feeling of being loved." During cross-examination, Brian Steele tried to reframe the situation. "You're an adult, college-educated, experienced, so why not quietly find another job and leave like other women do?" Mia responded without hesitation, "Because this wasn't a job, it was a world, and I lived in his world." She added, "If I left, I wouldn't just lose my job. I'd lose connections, my name, even the feeling that I existed." The segment ended with a moment that left the courtroom in stunned silence. Mia had applied to 4 different companies in 2020, all of which rejected her not for lack of qualifications, but for having worked with Sean Combs. One human resources rep called in as a remote witness confirmed via Zoom. "We were advised not to hire anyone who had worked under Mr. Combs, not because they were incompetent, but because they brought drama." The session adjourned at 5:00 p.m. As attendees exited, a Latina journalist who had covered the Harvey Weinstein trial quietly told her colleague, "This is the first time I've seen violence that wasn't a slap. It was praise that became a prison." Outside, a small group of women held signs, "Control without fists is still control. Don't ask why she didn't leave. Ask why he made her afraid to." In the fading Manhattan evening, the invisible wounds began to speak, not just through the voice of one woman, but through the reckoning of an entire system. For years, when people heard Bad Boy Records, they thought of names like Notorious B.I.G., Mace Mary J. Blige, or Sean P. Diddy Combs himself, the founder of a music empire once hailed as the cradle of modern hip-hop. But behind the stage lights and Grammy red carpets was a list of women the history of music never bothered to document or deliberately chose to forget. Cassie Ventura was one of them. In 2006, Cassie became an overnight sensation with her hit Me and You, a sensual minimalist track that Diddy promoted heavily, launching her to number 3 on the Billboard Hot 100. The world saw her as Diddy's latest muse, young, beautiful, quiet. But nearly 2 decades later, the world learned what lay behind that silence. In 2023, Cassie filed a lawsuit against Diddy, accusing him of rape, physical abuse, and coercing her into participating in so-called freak-offs private events, where sex power and humiliation were blurred and masked as exclusive parties. In her court filing, Cassie wrote, "I don't know when I stopped being me. I just know that one day I was gone. I didn't speak out because he told me, if you talk, I'll make the whole industry turn its back on you." The lawsuit ended in a confidential civil settlement. Diddy admitted no guilt, and Cassie made no further public statements. The case quickly faded. But by June 2024, when the criminal trial began, her name resurfaced, not as a vanished pop star, but as one of the first exposed links in the unraveling of the Diddy empire. And Cassie wasn't alone. Another woman using the alias Gina had worked with Diddy's choreography team during his 2012 tour. She appeared in court as an anonymous witness. Gina testified that she once saw Mia being dragged out of a meeting by the collar after refusing to prepare clothing for a female guest Diddy had scheduled privately. She described a disturbing hierarchy. There were women whose only purpose was to please others, and if they didn't do it well enough, they disappeared. Not with violence, with erasure. Gina left the tour midway after a party she described as a mix between a porn set and a political fundraiser. She never spoke about it until the trial. Her reason for finally stepping forward, because I saw someone like Mia stand up and I couldn't let her stand alone. Then there was Jane Doe, number 4, a Jamaican-born woman who had worked as a cleaner at Diddy's Miami estate. She didn't know much about music, but she remembered vividly a night in March 2015 when she cleaned a guest room after a party. The room was still in disarray, wrinkled bed sheets, spilled liquor, the lingering scent of weed and cigars. She saw a girl on the floor naked, motionless. When she called the house manager, she was told sternly, "Not your business." An hour later, when she returned, the door was locked. Jane Doe never learned who the girl was, but she never forgot her face. I don't know what happened, but I knew I didn't want to work there another day. She quit quietly. No one asked. No one followed up. More and more names began to emerge, not stars, not producers, not influencers with millions of followers. They were assistants, studio techs, housekeepers, tour managers. They all shared one thing: they had been silent. They were the women erased from the history of the music industry, not because they lacked talent, but because they lost their voice in a world run by power and fear. During closing arguments, prosecutor Emily Johnson didn't dwell on Mia. She devoted most of her time to the other women, as if to emphasize that this trial wasn't just about a single person, but a whole ecosystem. We sang their songs, bought the albums, went to the concerts, called them kings of hip-hop. But did anyone ever ask what happened to the women behind the scenes, the ones who booked the flights, fixed the stages, made the meals? What did they live through? That question was no longer rhetorical. It had become a moral proposition the trial forced society to confront. American music history had long celebrated its glittering chapters: the rise of hip-hop, the ascent of black moguls, the influence of street culture on national politics. But in the margins, there were other chapters, unwritten ones. Wordless ones composed not of lyrics or beats, but of the stifled sobs of forgotten women. And perhaps for the first time in decades, those sobs were being translated into testimony. As witness after witness took the stand, as messages lit up the screen, as fragments of statements began to form a coherent picture, the realization grew: what was most disturbing in the trial of Sean P. Diddy Combs wasn't any single act of violence. It was the way those acts were organized, concealed, and legitimized by a system where no one claimed responsibility, but everyone benefited. At the center of that system, according to testimony from over a dozen witnesses and data from more than 80 internal emails, was a recurring event discreetly known as the Midnight Party. At the 23rd day of trial, a former event coordination assistant using the alias Alexis took the stand with a stack of documents in hand, color-coded calendars, internal emails, and security staffing rosters. Alexis had worked for a third-party luxury event agency that serviced high-end entertainment and political clients. She described how Diddy's private parties were organized. The location was always kept secret until just before the event, sent only via encrypted apps like Signal or Wicker. Guests didn't use real names, but rather codes like F3M14 Violet 7. All phones were confiscated at the door, and internal cameras were disabled except for hallway footage kept for insurance purposes. One email from Diddy to someone identified only as JS, later confirmed to be his legal operations manager, read, "Ensure everything is event clean by 2:30 a.m. No audio, no traces. Violet 7 is attending. This email was sent 6 hours before a party at the Edition Hotel Penthouse in Miami, coinciding with a separate witness's claim of being assaulted that same night. Prosecutor Emily Johnson presented a list of 23 individuals who had attended these secret gatherings between 2016 and 2021. Among them were 2 Oscar-winning actors, a senior policy advisor to a 2020 presidential campaign, a prominent black female tech entrepreneur, and 3 attorneys previously affiliated with women's rights advocacy. None of them have been charged, at least not yet. But several, after being named in court, immediately shut down their social media accounts, canceled press appearances, or issued legal statements denying any wrongdoing. What stood out was, this financial disclosures presented in court revealed that at least $5 million had been paid to various law firms to pre-resolve disputes related to these parties. Most of these payments were funneled through Delaware-based shell companies favored for their strict corporate confidentiality laws. A leaked audio recording between Diddy and an assistant included a chilling line, "They're not gonna talk. Trust me. They all built their images on this name." One attorney, Marvin Ledbetter, formerly with the firm Defray & Comber, was referenced repeatedly. Though never directly representing Diddy, Ledbetter had allegedly brokered settlements in at least one case involving a model injured during a 2017 party. Payment logs showed Marvin received $285,000 across 3 installments flagged under the tag media risk management, a euphemism often used for sensitive settlements. Prosecutor Emily Johnson called this network of legal facilitators the ones who don't erase evidence but who legalize silence. One email from Marvin's assistant to Diddy's team read, "Victim has signed. As usual, NDA plus therapy coverage, plus relocation stipend. No admission, no denial." Perhaps most troubling, Johnson revealed, were at least 3 incidents reported to local police involving illegal sexual conduct, none of which led to formal criminal investigations. In a 2018 case in Los Angeles, a woman claimed she was assaulted during a party at Diddy's Holmby Hills estate. The police recorded the report but were unable to proceed because the alleged victim had flown to London within 48 hours. Follow-ups failed. Guest interviews yielded no leads. 3 years later, that same woman, under the alias LAR, testified at the current trial now with a new name and a wig. To close the day's session, the prosecution played a 23-second clip captured by a security camera that had mistakenly been left running in the waiting lounge at the Viceroy Hotel during the infamous X9 party in 2019. In the footage, a young woman stood in a corner weeping. A man in security gear said, "Wipe your face. Smile. He's coming." Then the clip ended. It was just a moment. No names, no overt crime, but perhaps the most powerful indirect piece of evidence, a snapshot of an entire system. A system that had learned how to silence cries before they ever became evidence. As the final puzzle pieces came into focus, legal experts, journalists, and the public began asking a new question, no longer just about Diddy the man, but about the machinery that protected him for over 2 decades. It was a legal question, but it carried political and moral weight. Was this a RICO case? RICO stands for the Racketeer, Influenced, and Corrupt Organizations Act, a law enacted in 1970 originally designed to dismantle Italian mafia operations in New York. But over the past 50 years, it has evolved into a powerful legal tool used to take down organized systems of crime, from drug cartels to corporate fraud rings. To apply RICO charges, prosecutors must prove the existence of a structured organization, formal or informal enterprise. At least 2 predicate criminal acts committed within a 10-year span. A clear connection between those acts and the purpose of the enterprise. That the organization continued to function after the crimes were committed. In this case, court records and testimony suggested that Bad Boy Records Combs Enterprises and its network of affiliated shell companies didn't merely operate as entertainment ventures, but as an internal power structure where no one questioned the man at the top and everyone was expected to maintain silence. One witness, a former CFO of Combs Enterprises, testified under oath, "I thought I was working for a music label. But after 3 years, I realized we spent more money cleaning up messes than producing artists. Internal financial documents from 2012-2020 showed 78 transactions listed as unclassified legal expenses totaling over $12 million. 16 payments described as PR risk insurance, which according to testimony were essentially bribes to prevent investigative reporting. 5 direct transfers to law firms in connection with sexual misconduct complaints, none of which went through the courts. All of these payments were executed by the company's finance division under the supervision of senior management. One challenge prosecutors faced was what the FBI calls organizational silos, a method of intentional fragmentation in the corporate structure. Each department, from security to assistants to asset managers to tour coordinators, was compartmentalized. No one was told what others were doing. Almost no one had the full picture. This matched a model previously used by Italian organized crime divide responsibilities so that no individual had enough information to become a threat. As prosecutor Emily Johnson explained, each person only saw a piece of the shadow. But when you put those pieces together, you see a system, intentional, self-preserving, and fully aware of how to cover its tracks. At present, Diddy faces individual charges: rape, kidnapping, human trafficking, witness intimidation, and money laundering. But no formal RICO indictment has yet been filed. However, legal experts believe the U.S. Attorney's Office is strategically prosecuting the case in fragments to gather testimony, solidify witness protection, and expose the broader structure before pursuing systemic charges. Attorney Glenn Ford, who had worked on the RICO case against NXIVM, the sex cult that branded women, told The Atlantic, "This is exactly how a major RICO case begins: target the individual, then pull on the threads. If a RICO indictment is filed, the implications are massive. Executives, advisors, lawyers, even celebrities who helped cover up, legitimize, or benefit from the criminal enterprise could be charged. Assets tied to the organization, real estate, brand contracts, intellectual property, could be seized under federal forfeiture laws. Victims who had previously signed NDAs, non-disclosure agreements, could be released and legally protected if they cooperate." One anonymous federal prosecutor told The Atlantic, "If this becomes a RICO case, it would be the largest criminal prosecution in American pop culture history." Emily Johnson ended her closing argument with one line that silenced the room. If this isn't what RICO was made for, then why does RICO exist? No one had an answer. But the jurors' eyes, the flood of RICO for Diddy hashtags online, and the growing silence from corporate partners once aligned with Combs all pointed in the same direction. This case was no longer just about one man. It was a referendum on an entire legal system and a warning to an industry that had long relied on unchecked power. Imagine walking into a courtroom where every eye is on you, not to watch you sing, not to see you perform, but to dissect every message you've ever sent during your loneliest moments. Words you never expected would be read aloud. Messages you once used to comfort someone or yourself. "Merry Christmas. I love you so, so much. I miss your smile. I'm sorry I failed you again." In ordinary life, messages like these might reflect an emotional bond. But in this courtroom, where every character is examined, every emoji becomes evidence, and every "I love you" is picked apart under the cold light of federal law, they become exhibits, not to prove affection, but to interrogate truth. After nearly 6 weeks of testimony, one question still hovered unanswered. Can we be judged or vindicated by the words we wrote when we were most vulnerable? Mia had to read her own texts aloud in front of the jury. Messages she once typed in the dark, wondering if she was to blame if her actions had triggered the rage of a powerful man, or if she just wasn't good enough to be loved in a kind, safe way. When asked, "Did you write these?" she nodded. Then added, "I thought if I was sweeter, more patient, more loving, then I'd be allowed to live in peace." It wasn't a confession. It was a survival logic, a blueprint for existing in a world she didn't control. In the end, the trial of Sean P. Diddy Combs wasn't just a criminal proceeding. It was a collision between two models of truth: one that believed abuse had to be visible, statements had to be consistent, and victims had to resist the right way, and another that understood truth often lives beneath layers of distorted memory, inherited shame, and the fear of not being believed. In that clash stood women like Mia Cassie Gina and Jane Doe, women who survived for years by staying silent, now asked to break that silence in a world that didn't guarantee they'd be believed, and Sean Combs. He sat through it all, never weeping, never speaking much, never directly confronting the accusations. The people who once hailed him as king of black culture, the model of ghetto-to-glory success, the bridge between art and commerce, they were silent. No one defended him in court. No celebrity filed a character letter. Even those who once called him mentor issued statements like, "I never saw anything inappropriate." Sometimes silence is the clearest answer of all. There was one particularly poignant moment unrecorded by cameras, but whispered about among those in attendance. It happened after Mia stepped off the witness stand for the final time and passed by the projection screen still displaying her old message. "I miss you." She stopped, stared at it for a long time. No one knows what she thought. But one reporter noted. She smiled, not with regret, but as if she finally saw the version of herself who wrote that message, in the right light. If you were forced to read your old texts in front of a courtroom full of strangers, what would you see, love, fear? A version of yourself you no longer recognize. That's the final mark this trial leaves, not merely a verdict against a powerful man, but a reminder that all power comes at a cost. And sometimes that cost is the silence of those who had to survive in the dark. On the final day of testimony, the prosecutor didn't say much. She posed one last question to the jury. If you see someone say, "I love you," does that mean they were never hurt? Or could it mean just maybe that they once believed love was the only way to be allowed to exist? There is no perfect answer. But in the jury's silence, in the media's anticipation, and in the gaze of a society watching closely, a new truth is being written. Not in blood, not in violence, but in words, the very words that were once dismissed as weak, messy, inconsistent, unworthy of belief. The final hours of the trial were a reckoning not just for Sean Combs, but for an entire industry that had long survived on loyalty, luxury, and silence. In one of the most striking observations, prosecutor Emily Johnson said, "In abuse trials, it's rarely the physical evidence that breaks the jury. It's the space between what's seen and what's felt, a smile in a video, a text sent at midnight, a birthday wish posted online. These can all become weapons, either to defend the accused or to show just how deep the control went, and indeed they were." Throughout the trial, defense attorney Brian Steele argued forcefully that love nullified fear, that if Mia had stayed, smiled, texted, "I miss you," then the abuse couldn't have been real, that victims must behave in ways that make their pain legible to outsiders. But the prosecution offered a different truth. They brought in psychologist after psychologist, story after story, email after email. They didn't ask the jury to see a perfect victim. They asked them to recognize something far more complicated and more honest. They painted a picture of a world where power doesn't just buy silence, it engineers it. In her final testimony, Mia didn't ask for pity. She didn't ask for revenge. She said simply, "I thought if I became perfect, he would stop hurting me. But the truth is, you can't please someone who only loves power." On the witness stand, Mia no longer cried. She didn't falter. Her voice carried not just pain, but clarity, one that only comes from surviving what should have destroyed you. The jury wasn't allowed to speak to the press, but as they left the courtroom, the weight in their faces said enough. They had witnessed more than a legal trial. They had been handed a societal mirror. In the days that followed, hashtags surged, "Diddy believe Mia," Rico for Diddy, texts, "Don't tell the whole story," "Control without fists," "She did leave but have followed," On talk shows, podcasts, and editorial columns, the questions grew louder. Can a culture that monetizes trauma ever truly protect the vulnerable? What does consent look like under economic and emotional captivity? And how many more Mias have we missed because they smiled and public entertainment executives scrambled? Contracts were paused. Artists distanced themselves. Major platforms began reevaluating promotional content tied to Combs. Some companies deleted tweets, others issued vague statements. But the silence from Diddy's former allies, artists, moguls, politicians spoke louder than any prepared quote. Meanwhile, legal scholars began citing the case in lectures and panels. At Columbia Law, Professor Janelle Rivers said, "This trial will be remembered not for its celebrity, but for its complexity. It showed us that abuse isn't always visible, that text messages lie, that NDAs bury stories, and that real power, thrives in ambiguity." At Howard University, student groups launched the Survivors' Words Project, collecting anonymous messages that survivors had once sent to their abusers, transforming them into art, advocacy, and education. And in courtrooms across the country, attorneys began referencing the United States versus Combs when challenging assumptions about victim behavior, trauma bonding, and digital narratives. The music industry too faced a choice: evolve or crumble under scrutiny. No longer could executives hide behind "we didn't know." No longer could awards and hit singles be used as moral currency. No longer could trauma be a footnote in someone else's legacy. And what of Diddy? His fate rested with the court, but his empire, regardless of the verdict, had been exposed, not just as a man, but as a system that had trained itself to survive every accusation, a system that had taught its victims to doubt their own truth, a system that confused affection with ownership, apology with dominance, silence with protection. And that system finally had a name. It was spoken not through verdicts alone, but through every message once typed in desperation, now echoed in resistance. If I love him enough, maybe he'll stop. He's the only one who sees the real me. You are still my peace. These were not contradictions. They were survival scripts. And now for the first time they were being heard not as evidence of deceit, but as testimony to the complexity of staying alive in a world that doesn't want your truth. This was not just a trial, it was a turning point. Not only for Mia, not only for Diddy, but for every system built on silence and every survivor who thought no one would believe them.